नमस्कार। आज के फेसबुक लाइव में आप सभी का स्वागत है। और आज की जो हमारी फिल्म है द एडवोकेट, जो केजी कन्नीबरन के पूरे जो वैधानिक लड़ाइयाँ थी, जो मानवाधिकारों के आंदोलन से जुड़ी हुई कहानियां हैं, उनको दर्शाती है। और इस फिल्म के संदर्भ में ये फिल्म बनाई है 2007 में, जो कि कन्नीबरन के देहावसान से थोड़ा ही पहले, 2 साल पहले बनाई गई थी। और दीपा धनराज जी ने इसे बनाया था। कल्पना कन्नीबरन, जो आज हमारी पैनलिस्ट है, उनका मैं स्वागत करती हूँ। कल्पना जी अपने आप में एक शख्सियत है, क्योंकि वो मानवाधिकार आंदोलन और स्त्री आंदोलन से जुड़ी हुई एक प्रमुख आवाज रही है। केजी कन्नीबरन के संदर्भ में उन्होंने कई लेख भी लिखे हैं, जो आपको इस पेज पे देखने को मिल सकते हैं। इस फिल्म को आज के तारीख में देखना इसलिए भी जरूरी है क्योंकि कल एक खबर आई थी जहां पर जो एक झूठी खबर थी कि वरवरा राव, जो इस समय जेल में है 80 साल के, उन्हें किसी भी प्रकार की वैद्यकीय सेवाएं उपलब्ध नहीं कराई जा रही है। और वो इस समय जूझ रहे हैं अपने जीवन के लिए। तो ऐसे समय में इस फिल्म का देखना ये इसलिए जरूरी बन जाता है क्योंकि ये फिल्म उन मानवाधिकारों को सबसे अहम रखती है जहां पर चाहे वो पॉलिटिकल प्रिजनर हो या फिर कोई एक गुनहगार जो किसी हत्या के लिए जेल में हो, लेकिन ये संविधान उनके कुछ अधिकार जो है उसको मानता है और उसको सुरक्षित रखने के लिए लड़ाई जनतंत्र के लिए जरूरी है। और केजी कन्नीबरन की ये जो आवाज थी, ये इस फिल्म ने बहुत सार्थक रूप से हमारे सामने रखी है। तो दीपा जी जो आज हमारे साथ जुड़ने वाली थी, उनकी तबीयत ठीक नहीं है। हम अपेक्षा करते हैं कि वो जल्दी स्वस्थ होंगी। तो कल्पना जी, आपसे ये सवाल पूछते हैं कि ये फिल्म जो एक ऐतिहासिक दस्तावेज है, किसी भी कानून की पढ़ाई करने वालों के लिए, मानवाधिकार आंदोलन के साथ जुड़े हुए लोगों के लिए, ये एक ऐतिहासिक दस्तावेज आप लोगों ने प्रस्तुत किया है। तो इस फिल्म की संकल्पना कैसे बनी और दीपा जी इसके साथ कैसे जुड़ी?
Thank you, Pragya and Saurabh and Cinema of Resistance for this invitation. मैं आज ज़्यादातर इंग्लिश में बोलूँगी क्योंकि बहुत सारे हमारे साथी तमिलनाडु से भी हैं और आंध्रा और तेलंगाना से भी हैं. So in the interests of trying to reach everybody, I will focus on English, apart from which, of course, when particularly when I'm speaking about issues like the constitution and law, my own work has been in English, so that is the language I'm most comfortable with. पहले तो मैं I want to express my solidarity with all the people who have been accused and are in jail in the Bhima Koregaon case. I have a particularly close relationship with the family of Varvar Rao, and they have been family to us for many decades now. So I begin this session with a note of solidarity with the family and demanding the release of Vivi and of all those accused in the Bhima Koregaon case. I also begin with the demand for the release of all the protesters and resistors who have been arrested for resisting the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019. And we know that there are several people who have in different states who have been put behind the bars for resisting this extremely unconstitutional act. And so a word of solidarity from my side and on behalf of my entire family to all those who face incarceration under extremely dangerous and unsafe conditions, apart from which the incarceration itself is unjust. I would also like, to spend a minute saying, and I think my mother, Vasant Kannabiran, and the rest of my family is also tuned into live at the moment. And so I would also like to begin by saying 2020 marks 10 years since the passing of my father, K.J. Kannabiran. He died in December 2010. And so we would like to use this occasion also to remember him 10 years after his passing. We are thinking of several things that we could possibly do, but under pandemic conditions that could be quite limited. And I think that there is nothing better than an occasion like this to remember him and his work. Having said that, I would like to give a brief introduction to K.J. Kannabiran and to the film. On K.J. Kannabiran himself, I think the Telugu readership is fairly well acquainted with his personal details, which I don't really want to go into at any great length at this point, except to say that his family consists of his wife, Vasant Kannabiran, a poet and a feminist activist and teacher of English, who is watching this show, and 3 children. His eldest daughter, Chitra Kannabiran, who is a geneticist and a scientist, Arvind Kannabiran, who is a cinematographer. Chitra is the eldest, I am the second, and Arvind is the youngest, and his son-in-law, my partner, Raj Mohan Tella, he has 2 grandchildren, now aged 27 and 21. Ramya, aged 27, is a geographer and illustrator, and Kirtana, aged 21, is studying development studies and is a dancer. So that's a brief kind of description of the family, and I think it's necessary for me to state this because ever so often I have been asked if I'm his only child. No, I'm not his only child. I'm the child in the middle. And on the to introduce the film itself, like I was telling Pragya yesterday when I spoke to her about the film, in response to her question of why this film, why this team, and so on, I want to state quite clearly upfront that if it was not for Deepa and Navroz, there would be no film. The film happened because Deepa and Navroz were family. The film is a family project in a sense. It's not simply a film to talk about K.J. Kannabiran, but to think through his work collectively within the emotional space of the family. What did this work mean to us, and how did we together understand and build upon it, both in terms of what he took forward and in terms of what each of us took forward in our own different ways, in our own different spheres of work. The ones that were, of course, most directly connected to his work were me and my mother, because of the areas that we worked in the women's movement, in the feminist movement, and in civil liberties. But also, I would like to say that the film was not something that was an isolated endeavor. We are talking about the period between 1998, 99 to 2009. And in this period, we have a lot of his work, in fact, being being archived, being kind of documented, being collated, and there are so many different people who have been involved with the family and with him in putting this archive together. Quite specifically, apart from random audio recordings that I commenced in about 97, 98, because he would just start rattling off cases and arguments, and I just felt I would lose it all somewhere. So I just sat down with an audio cassette recorder and started asking him to speak. That didn't really get me very far. I have a couple of audio cassettes. But that was also the time when, around 2000, 2001, when we started talking, Deepa, Navroz, and the rest of us in the family started talking about, what it would be like to make a film, what should the film have, what should be its limits. How do we think through the idea of a film that encapsulates his Sisyphean labors? And I must say that he always, the figure of Sisyphus was the figure that stood before him all the time. And he saw himself and his labors in the image of Sisyphus. If you look at the Advocate, at the very end of the Advocate, you will find that he closes almost with the observation that, of course, at some point, surely Sisyphus will roll that rock to the top of the hill. And this keeps coming up repeatedly. So we said, how do we then pull together those different strands? Is it possible to pull those different strands together, in the space of a film? At the same time that we were beginning to talk about the Advocate, I had also started to have conversations with him about pulling his essays together and maybe publishing it as a volume. And Amar, in fact, and I'll come to that later. He was very impatient about the idea of having to pull together essays, because he just wrote and then he published it either in PUCL Bulletin or in EPW or in any of the other local publications. But he never really thought in terms of putting them together in a collection. And he was excited at the prospect, but at the same time, impatient with the demands of an academic format. And so I then offered that I would put the entire thing together and only bother him where I needed a case reference or I needed some particular citation. So that was the agreement on which Wages of Impunity got made, because even the correspondence with the publisher was not with him. And at several points in the making of that book, when I persisted on a citation, he would simply say, I don't need this book. the third, and the title, interestingly, when I asked him, when we went as far as the title, and I asked him what title he wanted for the book, the title he gave me was The Labors of Sisyphus. And this was the title I sent to Orient Black Swan and then Orient Longman, I think. And then they wrote back and said that it wouldn't really work as a title. And then we just kept talking and then came up. I said, okay, you're speaking of impunity most of the time, so why not Wages of Impunity? And then we said, okay, that seems like a title that will work. So Wages of Impunity was actually a default title in that sense. At the exact time that the Wages of Impunity and The Advocate were being worked through step by step by step, we also had the third initiative that was set in motion by Amar Devlapalli, another very dear friend of the family, and N. Venugopal, who also happens to be Bibi's nephew, and we have been seeing him on Facebook Live since yesterday, following the reports of Bibi's ill health. And Amar and Venu wanted him to contribute a weekly column to a daily Prajatantra. And although they had been pursuing him since about 98, 99, he finally agreed. And the condition he then put, which Amar recounts in his foreword to this book, is that somebody should sit with him and take a dictation and he will write. So he had a weekly column called 24 Hours, Irvainal Gantalu, that ran for a little over a year. It ran from February 26 to 2006 to May 2008 in Prajatantra. And in 2009, November, the entire collection of essays, which was both autobiographical and a biography of the human rights movement and his own travels in the movement, that got published in 2009. So the film was premiered during his lifetime in 2007. The Wages of Impunity came out in 2004, but the last chapter in Wages of Impunity is actually a transcript of an interview that was part of The Advocate. And then you have 24 Hours being published as a book in Telugu in 2009, which again has parts of Wages of Impunity included as chapters in the Telugu translation. And you also have Venu figuring in The Advocate, you know, as part of the conversations he was having with Appa on various aspects. You have him figuring in conversations in The Advocate, especially giving an account of his election as the president of APCLC. So it was the point of giving this broad kind of introduction to The Advocate is that was a decade, you know, 1999 to 2009 was a decade when the entire family of KG Kannabiran and the friends who were within that family space in a very kind of tangible sense thought that this is not about this one man and we need to just put the entire history together. And there were, of course, people who figure in the film. You have Suresh and Nagasaila, advocates Suresh and Nagasaila from Tamil Nadu, from Chennai. The person you don't have figure in the film, but somebody who was very closely associated with him, who we lost in 2013, was Advocate Chandrasekhar, who was a special public prosecutor in the Chundur case. So you have this, the development of a jurisprudence that he speaks about in Wages of Impunity and that he speaks about in The Advocate are also themes that he revisits in very different ways, for instance, in 24 Gantadu. And you will also see it in several articles that he put out in the PUCL bulletin. And this period was also the period when he was very clear that he wanted to, to create an archive for the People's Union of Civil Liberties. And he and Dr. Chibber were in conversation with that. And so since I was anyway on this job, one of the things that we did together at that point was to digitize the back issues of PUCL bulletin so that it could go on the website. So if we are in fact speaking of The Advocate as a document, I think there is a large canvas that doesn't really fit into the frame of that 2-hour film, but that in fact forms part of the conversations that circulate within and outside the film.
Yeah. एक और चीज जो मुझे बहुत इम्पोर्टेंटली लगती है, मैं अपने सवाल जो है वो हिंदी में पूछूंगी अगर आपको तकलीफ ना हो तो। ये फिल्म कहीं पे भी उनको एक हीरो की तरह नहीं दिखाती। ये फिल्म जैसे आपने कहा कि जो बाकी उस दौर के सारे लोग थे जो इस आंदोलन से जुड़े हुए थे, उन सबकी आवाजों के साथ में आती है। लेकिन एक मुख्य चीज जो केजी कन्नीबरन कहते हैं कि हमारी सारी जो दिक्कत है वो जो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन ने फंडामेंटल राइट्स दिए हैं उनकी रक्षा करना है। तो आज की स्थिति में आपको ये जो कोशिश है, एक और चीज थी जब ये कहा गया था कि सुप्रीम कोर्ट के दरवाजे वो नहीं खटखटाते थे, वो जो निचली अदालतें हैं, सेशंस कोर्ट है, जो एक पेन्स टेकिंग जॉब होता है कि 10 बजे से लेके 4 बजे तक आपको जज के सामने प्लीड करना है, तो उन चीजों को वो बहुत महत्व देते थे। तो उस संदर्भ में आप बताइए कि ये जो पूरा उनका विजन था वो क्या था, कि लंबे दौर की लड़ाई लड़नी है तो अपने स्थानीय स्तर पे, लोकल लेवल पे लड़नी होगी और फिर उसको लेके आगे जा सकते हैं। तो उसके संदर्भ में उनका क्या विजन था और उस समय उनके सामने दिक्कतें क्या आई थी?
See, Pragya, the thing is that when he approached the Constitution, he didn't see it as limited or restricted to any particular sphere, not to any particular court. So if, for instance, you, and this is something that he constantly spoke about, that you can't disaggregate the Constitution into the preamble and the fundamental rights and the directive principles of state policy, that you have to see it as a whole and you have to see rights as essentially indivisible. If the right to life and liberty, the first judicial space where the right to life and liberty is negotiated is a court of original jurisdiction, is a sessions court or a special court. You need to then frame the argument on the Constitution in a way in which you in fact educate the judges in the trial courts that the Constitution does not fall outside of their writ or does not fall outside of their jurisdiction. That the reason why their court in fact sits and deliberates on the question of life and liberty is because their court enjoys the legitimacy and the sanction of the Constitution. And this point, in fact, if you know, refer you to a very cogent elaboration of this point that he makes in the context of a trial court. If you look at the tribute that advocates V. Suresh and Nagasaila wrote immediately after he died in the EPW, you will actually see them recounting a particular instance of a court where he in fact asks the judge to resign, if he doesn't believe that he needs to look at the Constitution, and then persuades the judge to shift his frame of reference to include an understanding of how the Constitution informs criminal law. So I think that the point that I'm trying to make is that he did not see courts as hampered or limited by jurisdictional issues where it came to the Constitution, because the Constitution was an overarching ethic that governed all courts in independent India, and this is something that he has emphasized right from the beginning, as far back as I can remember. The second was that he didn't believe that the Constitution is the exclusive preserve of the legal profession or the courts alone. So whether it is with reference to directive principles of state policy or with reference to fundamental rights, he believed that every citizen has a stake in the Constitution and must assert that stake in the Constitution. So that while he appeared in courts, he also speaks in the film, for instance, at one point, where he says that because there were all these poets and political activists being produced in courts during emergency, there were crowds that came to courts every time there was a hearing. And he made that the space of political education, so that after arguing the case all day in courts, he always made it a point to come out and address the gathering. So I think that idea, and this is something that I've been calling the constitutional commons, or the Constitution as commons, the idea that the Constitution is a commons that belongs to all of us, is something that he kind of kept pushing in so many different ways, throughout the time that he was working. And there's a very crucial point that he makes in the film. And of course, his preoccupation was with personal liberty. And the question that, the point that he raises is that the minute you preventively detain a person, you defeated all the other rights of that person. So you can't say, no, we have only infringed on the right to personal liberty, but the person has free speech and expression and association and everything else. Because the minute you deny a person personal liberty, all other rights are defeated in that one stroke. So I think there were several different levels at which...
Sorry. There is one other dialogue also that he makes, that it is not their values, but it is your values that are in question.
Absolutely.
When you are talking about the Constitution, the Constitution is the fundamental thing with which this country has come to being. So if we all are the citizens, then the Constitution has only recognized those rights. We have those rights. So that is something, a very important kind of thing, where the agency of the citizen becomes a very important thrust of the democracy. In this age, when this kind of agency itself is seen as a kind of dissent, how do we look at this film and those efforts? Probably, there was no age when he says that, the judges have always listened to me. But today, when we see that Sudha Bharadwaj or Varvara Rao, when they approach the courts, regarding their ill health, the courts have closed the eyes. So I think the culture of impunity that he talks about has pervaded far more vigorously in this time, or is it something that there have been always the kind of instances, but these are the things that we are seeing at one point of time?
Yeah, the question of dissent was in fact the question that civil liberties advocacy began with in right from 68, 69 to the early 70s. You had the progressive writers being arrested under various laws. Also, the AP Public Safety Ordinance after a point. But the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, you had several. And the idea was that dissent is a right in a democracy. And so the argument that we are putting forth today in 2020 is an argument that has a history, not just in AP, but across different parts of the country, right from the very early 1970s at least. And particularly during the emergency, we of course know, I of course know of cases in Andhra Pradesh much more, but of course there were cases all over. I mean, there were disappearances, there were encounters, there were killings, there were arbitrary arrests in different parts of the country, in different states, and there were stiff fights put up in every one of those states. But the fight on often now, for instance, when we look at the cases before us, and you did mention the case of VV and Sudha Bharadwaj and Anand Teltumbre and all the others, you have courts, criminal courts unwilling, GN Sai Baba, you have courts unwilling to concede any ground. You have courts accepting very flimsy constructions of complicity put out by the prosecution. But this is also not new. I mean, I don't really want to construct a golden age. I think at the time that he lived and worked, the courts were a mixed bag. So you had judges who were willing to listen, and you had those who were unwilling to listen. You had judges who were complicit with an authoritarian state, and you had those who just applied very, very, like he says, not, even if they were anti-communist, they just applied liberal values, and he managed to get decisions in his favor. So I think that there is the lesson really to be learned is the lesson of Sisyphus. That rock has to roll up, and one has to keep trying till that rock rolls up the hill. And once it rolls up the hill, of course, you have no guarantee that it won't come down. It is an incessant struggle. So in one of his unpublished pieces, written around 2007 or 2008, he actually says, there is really no end to the struggle, because the struggle is its own reward. And I really think that, when we are fighting a criminal state or a rogue state or an authoritarian state or a supremacist state, we do need to keep in mind the fact that there is really no alternative to an incessant questioning. There will be loss of liberty, there will be loss of life, We have seen that in the earlier era as well. But there is really no alternative to just pushing those limits as far as we can push it. We know, for instance, from the film, one of the incidents he talks about is the encounter in Giraipalli forest, which was one of
Hmm,
the
hmm,
earliest
hmm.
encounters during the emergency. And and just to share an anecdote, I mean, there were 5 people who were apprehended in that particular case. All 5 were tied to trees, 4 were shot, and one was allowed to run away.
Allowed to go.
And
That
that
became the
one
witness.
person, Dikshapati, was a star witness in the Bhargava Commission. And I remember there was really no safe space for Bhikshapati to stay. And so, as long as he was deposing in the Bhargava Commission, he was staying in our house. And we were all around the same age, and so the memory of somebody who's 18 or 19, who is around your age, who has been subjected to unimaginable torture. And he was completely silent. I don't think I ever heard Bhikshapati speak more than one word at a time. Completely silent, completely traumatized by the violence, uh, but appearing, and he's been tortured, and he's actually going and appearing and testifying before the one-man commission. It is quite a different experience, to witness that kind of courage. And if you have actually been witness to that, then you can never actually lose hope. You say no. Bhargava Commission, of course, didn't come to very much, but that didn't stop the struggle for ending state impunity. You still kind of pushed ahead, and you still won victories. So I think on that score, one really needs to, to keep the faith, as they say, in the Constitution, but also in a collective struggle
Efforts.
and a collective
Yeah.
commitment, to pushing it further.
Yeah, that is something very important because uh, I remember as one strategy when Hargopal talks that it was a very important thing when there was a deadlock between the Maoist and the government. Kannabiran said that let's go to the public, or hold the hearings in public, or when the witness is somebody whose life is in danger, we will not allow it to hold it in one camera or in a closed room, but have it in public. So in fact, when you have now the that kind of courage to look into the eyes of the rulers and say that if you do something like this, you will be fascist. If you target the people in this manner, you will be fascist and not the democratic government. That was something very important at that point. But what I'm trying to say is that when today we really have the fascist rulers, fascist in terms of its actual this thing, uh, and when you have to go to the public, at times public itself is becoming a faceless violent mob. At this point, where do we go? How do we build this kind of collective commitment towards the constitutional values, towards the political? How do we go in terms of having political education of the people? Because it was very important thing to say that people have started recognizing state violence as something, a problem, or encounter, the state killing as encounter. So that kind of commitment to the values, core values of the democracy, uh, how do we go in terms of political education of the people, where the public is not a nuisance but a kind of protection for you?
Yeah. Well, I think the character of public engagement changes from one time to another. I know that at that time, all of them, all of the lawyers and the members of APCLC, a large section of whom were teachers. They were university and college teachers. Public education meetings every weekend, their meetings in different districts. I mean, all of these people, Professor Hargopal, Appa, you had other people like, so many of them actually, too many to recount. Bal Gopal, all of them, Kodand Ram Reddy, all the Pradeep, all of these people, Madhusudan Raj Yadav, who was later killed in an encounter, you had them constantly engaging with the public, constantly addressing the public, constantly entering into a dialogue and debate with them, people like Vivi. So you had a whole range of public engagement of a different kind that belonged to that moment. But I really don't think we should ask a question of how do we engage the public, especially after Shaheen Bagh. Because I think what Shaheen Bagh has done is that it has significantly shifted the meaning of public engagement with the Constitution to a different level altogether. And so, really, the question that we need to ask is, how is the public engagement with the Constitution that was inaugurated in Shaheen Bagh, how are we actually going to learn from it? How are we actually going to learn from the struggles of Muslim women who are right out there and telling you what the Constitution means at a time when they are facing disenfranchisement under the CAA? So I think that what we really need to do constantly, and I think that this was something that he was also quite aware of all the time, that you do need to calibrate your responses and your reading of public engagement, of the meanings of the Constitution, of particular articulations of the Constitution that are needed at particular times. And I think that was really something that he was a master at. And I can give you two particular examples also in the light of the kind of cases that we have coming up before us. In his discussion in the film on conspiracy, he talks, I think it was about the Secunderabad conspiracy case. At some point, he talks about the fact of conspiracy and how the moment he argued and managed to establish that the charge of conspiracy was not proved, then all of the other charges fell flat because they all hinged on the charge of conspiracy. But interestingly, and what doesn't figure in this film, is the opposite argument that he put, which he in fact wrote up in an essay that was published in a book I edited, where he talks about the fact that conspiracy is never used for crimes of dominance. So, for instance, when Dalits were massacred in Karanchedu, or Dalits were massacred in Chunduru, or Dalits were massacred in Melavalu, the fact is that there was a conspiracy. But this was not a conspiracy in the dark of night, on a moonless night, on a terrace with birds carrying messages or something, some coded message on a cell phone or on a telephone. It was not that kind of conspiracy. It was an open conspiracy in the middle of the village where all the dominant caste men got together and decided that they would massacre the Dalits in the village, armed themselves, armed each other, and went and massacred at an appointed time. And his argument was that you must make out the offense of conspiracy in crimes of dominance. And I know that there were several, in fact, when Chandrasekhar was going to argue the Chunduru case, practically every day that he was appearing in court, they would have a long phone conversation between Guntur and Hyderabad, where they would actually discuss the legal strategy that could be adopted by Chandra in court. And one of the arguments that Chandra, in fact, put in the Chundur case, and we must remember that the trial court, in fact, convicted after a very long gap, but they did convict several of the accused in the Chundur massacre. Now, one of the arguments that Chandra, in fact, adopted in the Chundur case was the charge of conspiracy. And that was the judge, I think, from my memory, did not agree to the charge of conspiracy, but all of the other charges were made out. But the conspiracy was deemed not to have been made out. But they did, So when the argument that conspiracy doesn't have to be a hidden thing, that there is something like an open conspiracy, is something that we are arguing today in the light of the violence in Northeast Delhi. That there was a meeting of minds, that there was a planning, that there was a coordination, and there was a concerted action to achieve a common end. And the point is that I think what really made his approach to jurisprudence quite made it actually stand out and quite unique was the fact that he related arguments, particularly arguments related to structural violence and political and state violence. He related those arguments to the ideological apparatuses of dominance that are operative in a society at any given time. And his firm belief was that unless you embed those arguments in an understanding of how ideologies of dominance work, you will never succeed in pushing the goals of the Constitution. The second major argument, and I will then just give you the mic. The second major argument that he put forth was in the Polavaram case, which was a case where the Polavaram Dam, land was acquired, and several villages that came under a Schedule 5 area faced submergence because of the Polavaram Dam. And of course, there were Adivasis in the affected areas, across the affected areas, protesting against the dam. And he didn't have, unfortunately, written arguments for this case. But the argument he made was quite distinctive. He said that the boundaries of a Schedule 5 area can only be altered by presidential notification. By planning a dam that will submerge entire villages, and along with those villages that fell in a Schedule 5 area would also submerge the institutions of that Schedule 5 area, the schools, the panchayats, and the other institutions in the Schedule 5 area. What the state was in fact doing was altering the boundaries of the Schedule 5 area without presidential assent. And therefore, it was impermissible under the Constitution. Now, today we are facing the eviction in 2019, and the case is still before the Supreme Court. We are facing the eviction of Adivasis and forest dwellers
Forests.
from the forest. So the question of how do we approach the jurisprudence and how do we actually argue a position on the entitlement, the fundamental right of forest dwellers to remain there. I think we have some really interesting pointers that he provides us in the course of his arguments on the Polavaram Dam. So I think it's important to focus on the encounters. And he saw Haren Pandya being killed in his time, and we see Vikas Dubey being killed now. We have, of course, encounters. We have arbitrary arrests and the criminalizing of dissent, which was also consistent then. We have the question of the public education, which took a very different form at his time. It is very much there, and it takes a very different form today. We only have to recognize that that is the form that it takes today. But I think that outside of those spaces, there are also, arguments to do with the Muslim backward classes. There are arguments to do with land rights of Muslims in the old city of Hyderabad. There are arguments to do with the conceptualization of the offense of conspiracy on very different terms than what is commonly understood. I mean, you always associate conspiracy with Maoists, terrorists, and people who are trying to overthrow the state. But you don't associate conspiracy with collaborators of the state, in which the state feeds into the conspiracy and, in fact, enables it. Yeah. So I think that turnaround is, so we need to actually look, I think, at a lot of these very, very different articulations that were possible.
Even the Sohrabuddin Kausarbi case,
Yeah.
where the state becomes part of the entire conspiracy and withholds it.
Yeah.
What is very important, as Vrinda Grover has said, that it is very important that the lawyers need to connect with the social movements, and Kannabiran became a kind of a devil's advocate at each end. With the people's movement also, where they had problems, where they were not following the democratic process, they were not transparent, he pointed out, or where there were killings, there were tortures, he pointed out. So, and at the state level also, so this constantly withholding your position, or rather the position of the constitution, and having your both legs in the movement and the state, so how does this thing has to work in future as a strategy for people who are lawyers, for the people who are in the social movement, uh, who also need to introspect what is wrong, uh, what is where the where they are uh, uh, dominating the rights of the others. How does one deal with this dilemma?
Well, I think the point Brinda Reshi probably raised it in the chat, but this is something that we constantly keep talking about. I think that the most important point is that there is, and something that he upheld through his entire work, was that there is a necessary and vital connection between collective mobilization, social critique, and courtroom practices. That was certainly one part of it. The second part of it was that you know the focus, and this I see more and more now, uh, the focus on the Supreme Court as the space of deliverance from all evil is really something that we need to roll back from. I think we invest too much of energy in the Supreme Court. I think we need to return back to empower courts of different jurisdictions, and to present constitutional arguments in each of those spaces. I don't think we can afford to say, to go running to the Supreme Court with a BIL each time may not really be the best option. So there is a live connection with movements, and one must use every possible judicial space that we have. And in saying that there has to be a connect with collective movements and with human rights movements, I think that connect is also important, because both lawyers and movements need to constantly democratize and re-democratize themselves. And we have several instances of movements not at some stage not being very democratic, and then having to fight for that democracy. So on this, I will kind of close. I think we are at the close of the session, so I do want to close with saying that the biggest challenge to Kannabiran's work and the biggest test to his work came from the feminist movement, and the fact that he had 3 generations of feminists sitting in the family and putting him through a trial by fire for every single thing, whether it was a case of rape or the peace committee, which initially only had men. And I remember us just drawing Professor Hargopal and Kannabiran and Shankaran and DN through coals, saying, how is this even possible that we have been here as the women's movement from 1978, and you have not one woman on your committee? And then they took in one woman, a senior journalist, but it was still not an equitable representation, and we never let them forget that. And so
I remember Masan Kannabiran mentions it very categorically that I did not join APCL because I will be always looked at Kannabiran's wife, and will never be regarded as a political person who has an independent voice. I think that kind of as I was telling you, that having personal is political in the house constantly 24/7 is a difficult task.
And it was not a difficult task. It wasn't difficult for him. He had to get used to it, because he really had no alternative. There was not one. There were 3, and my brother's feminist, my partner's feminist, and there are 2 granddaughters who are also feminists. So there really wasn't an option, it was a household that was full of questions, and for whom he was not sacrosanct, he was not a dawn, he was not infallible. The spirit that you see in the film of him not being raised on a pedestal was exactly the kind of person he was in the home, and I think that the emotional labor of building a democratic consciousness that was completely self-critical and self-reflexive and questioning is an enormous emotional labor. And I think that is really where in several instances you will find people, men especially, who are completely democratic outside and completely autocratic inside the house. And that separation really didn't work in our home. And I think that's really what made him distinctive. The fact that he moved from one equitable space into a public domain where he demanded that everybody is equitable. And in the beginning of this session, I have Jabin's name down, but I hadn't mentioned it. And I must say that, if you see the film in the way in which it has come out, and there's a deep interiority to the film that surfaces. And that really is Deepa, it is Navroz, and importantly, it is Jabin. I mean, Jabin was the editor, and the kind of engagement that she has had in the making of that film, as you see it, in that 2-hour capsule.
Yeah.
I think she has just captured that entire spirit of the entire of the dialogues that we have had all along.
Yeah, definitely, because entire the 2-hour conversations, you never feel, you feel that, if you move your eyes from the screen, then you are going to miss out something. So that kind of captivity, to maintain that is a definite this thing. Thank you so much for having a discussion with us on FB Live with Cinema of Resistance. And we do hope that the culture of impunity comes to an end with our collective struggles and commitments at all levels, with introspective dialogue within the movements and the individuals, and we respect the personal liberties and the constitutional values for the sake of democracy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kalpana Kannabiran, for joining us.
Thank you, Pragya, and thank you, Saurabh, for all the trouble. Thanks. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in. It's been wonderful having you watch this show. Thanks.
Thank you.